At the end of the last lecture, we were considering some of the ideas presented by Nishitani Kaiji, a recent Japanese philosopher who is trained in both Japanese and Western thought. He certainly, as a result of his training, recognizes that there's a transcultural dimension to experience in the modern world. And he also attempts to bring some of his transcultural training to bear on modern issues. He notes that we've focused a lot of energy as a people, as a society in both the West and the East, on developing powerful technologies in the recent past. But actually, because we put so much energy into that, perhaps, we've tended not to pay so much attention to questions of meaning and value. For the last century and a half, Western thinkers certainly have been focusing a lot on what they view as a crisis in values. So, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche suggests that the modern world faces a problem that he calls nihilism, the problem that the values that used to hold society together don't seem to work anymore, don't seem to have that kind of fundamental role. Martin Heidegger, a 20th century philosopher, emphasizes the way that technology has taken all of our attention and directed our attention away from what's really important. Paying close attention to both of these thinkers, Nishitani suggests that perhaps the concept of emptiness, the Buddha nature, can actually serve as a basis for meaning in the modern world. That this is something that he thinks the world as a whole can recognize, a kind of interdependent reality from which everything emerges. Now, I think the fact that he proposes concretely a transcultural solution to contemporary problems is interesting. And one of my assumptions in a course like this is that, indeed, a lot of our answers to problems in the future will probably draw on ideas that have come from various parts of the world. What I'm going to do in this lecture primarily is to review some of the general issues that seem to appear around the world and some of the answers that we've been considering. One of the basic philosophical issues that it seems to be a problem for people everywhere is what is real. We notice that in Western thought and some Indian thought, there is sometimes thought to be a very sharp distinction between a reality and appearance, or perhaps different orders of being. Plato, for example, considers the world of appearances, this plane, to be a fairly pale copy, in effect, of a purer, truer realm. So appearance is less real than this pure realm of the forms. On the other hand, people in the West aren't universally agreed about that. Even Plato's own student Aristotle disagreed with the idea of a separate realm, though he did think a distinction could be made between appearances and some fundamentals that remain the same over time. In Indian thought, similarly, we sometimes find a distinction made between what's apparent, particularly individuation, and a fundamental reality that is underlying all of that. Buddhist and Taoist thought, too, focus on the idea of the whole being the most real, although they have different ways of articulating it. For the Buddhists, the whole, at least the Mahayana Buddhists, the whole is the only thing that exists. Separate individuals or separate selves, separate things don't exist at all. For the Taoists, there's a certain sense in which we are real as individuals, though nevertheless, the way to understand that reality is always with the idea of the larger reality of the Tao in our minds. Another general quandary that occurs to people throughout the world is, what are we? What is the nature of the self? In the West, as we've mentioned, the emphasis has tended to be on the individual. Perhaps the individual is understood as a soul, or with Descartes, the idea that as an individual we're a thinking substance. We have individual minds. But this isn't the view of many societies. For example, the Yoruba people don't think that you can simply divide ourselves into mind and body, but suggest that there are multiple soul elements. And these elements are, in a way, partly soul, partly body. They're not something that you can't really draw a line between what's physical and what's spiritual. At the same time, even though the Yoruba think that many soul elements have to come together to be a person, they also believe in reincarnation. So it's possible that at the same time that you come together by means of all these different partial souls coming together, You might also be a reincarnation of a deceased grandparent or someone else from your lineage. The notion of reincarnation figures in the thought of other societies as well, as we've noticed. So, for example, in Brahmanistic thought, the idea is that human beings, at least by most Brahmanists, the idea is that human beings do reincarnate. Buddhist thought similarly has a notion of reincarnation. Though we've pointed out that the idea of a separate self in Buddhism is a problematic notion, and so a lot of explanation needs to be done philosophically in order to account for the fact that there is reincarnation, even though the individual self, in some sense, is illusory. Another approach to the question of selfhood is the idea that the self is not a separate individual, but more related to others. This is a notion, too, that is prominent in the thinking of the Yoruba. So, for example, when you think of yourself, the self, or the person, takes a place in a whole society. In fact, even being a person is something that assumes that you've come to maturity and come to play out a role in society. Personhood is something that is, in a certain sense, acquired. You become a person by assuming that role. Chinese thought, too, tends to view the self in very relational terms. For example, in discussing Confucianism, we notice that the self is always considered to be in relationship to other people. Indeed, for Confucians, if you were to ask or be asked, "Who are you?" a proper way of approaching the question would be largely in terms of your relations. Well, I'm the sister of so-and-so, or I'm the daughter of my parents. I'm the mother or father of my children. Such answers as that all help to explain who it is that you are. There isn't a really strong notion of self apart from relations. And so any kind of consideration that you're going to give to how you as a self ought to behave is always going to take that whole texture into account. For the Taoists, too, though the relations they focus on are rather different from the Confucians, relation is fundamental. The fact that we're related to the flow of nature, that all of our activities are only successful or unsuccessful in relation to nature, is fundamental to who we are. The American Indians as well have a notion of a relational self. Indeed, our relationships extend beyond our human world to the animal world, to nature as a whole, and to the earth itself. The American Indian theory also indicates something that is a fairly fundamental principle, that how we consider the human being to be, what we consider a self to be, often has implications for what we understand our ethical obligations to be. So, for example, the American Indians focus on the idea of the human world and the animal world and the world of the earth as a whole all being a family. Well, that gives people obligations not just to other human beings, but to animals, to the earth, to the land as well. The Aztecs have a certain notion as to how we are and how we've come to be, and this too generates obligations. We wouldn't be here at all, as they understand it, if the gods hadn't sacrificed themselves in order to form our sun. And so one of the things that's appropriate, and indeed a moral obligation, is to offer sacrifice. Moreover, because this gift of the gods, the sun, is something that needs to be supported, human sacrifice is absolutely essential in order to keep the energy of the sun continuing. The Yoruba notion of self plays a role in the sense of what ethical obligations are. So, for example, you have obligations to your ancestors. You wouldn't be here if they hadn't been there. And one of the ways to repay ancestors is to take on a role in your society, to work, to help to support the tribe in that respect. To have children is another way of repaying the ancestors. Not only does it keep the line going, indeed it might provide an occasion for the ancestors to come back. Brahmanism also sees obligations coming from the particular notion of self that Brahmanism develops. The particular self that we seem to be in this life and the roles that we undertake, the traits that we have, according to Brahmanism, is a function of karma. Karma being that principle that actions from the past continue to have implications in the present. So the obligations that we have much to do with a situation that our previous acts have brought about. And often this is understood in terms of ourselves, in some sense, acting in a previous life. Certainly the Confucian conception of ethical obligation has much to do with relationship. Indeed, when Confucius says, let a father be a father, a son, a minister, a ruler, all of these point out that what one really is and ought to be is a function of how you're connected to other people. So ethical obligations depend a lot on how it is that we see human beings to relate to one another. In general, people throughout the world have often asked, what is the world as a whole? Plato certainly reflected on this. As we mentioned before, he thought this world was a reflection of a truer world, a world that this is in some sense a kind of copy of. Aristotle, by contrast, thought that this world is reality. Even though he focuses on essences that are unchanging, he doesn't seek reality in some other plane. For the American Indians, similarly, the natural world is reality. And indeed, the reality that it is the reality of a family structure. We're completely a part of a whole family, and our sense of the world is very much the connection of family members to each other. The ancient Sankhya system in Indian thought had a conception of reality as coming in two different forms. One, the reality of the natural world, and two, the reality of consciousness. Although Sankhya acknowledged reality on both dimensions, the belief in this system is that the two really don't have anything to do with each other, and it's our confusion of the two that causes all of our problems. The natural world here is real, but it's felt to be a contamination to consciousness in many respects. And it's interesting where the line is drawn in the Sankhya system, since even the sorts of tendencies in ourselves that we would view as psychological often are analyzed as something other than consciousness, as part of the interaction between consciousness and the natural world that, strictly speaking, is a mistake. So the effort there is to detach from this natural world, even though it is reality. Some Brahmanistic schools, such as Advaita Vedanta, tend to see the world as a whole as really an illusion, at least as we usually see it. That reality is fundamentally one. Indeed, I think that claim could be made for all the Brahmanic schools. Reality is one, namely Brahman. And this world somehow, the world that we see around us, is a manifestation of Brahman. Those schools vary on whether or not they grant it any reality at all. The Chinese tend to look at the world as a whole as composed of a common thing, namely qi, energy. And so things within the world relate to each other by means of this, in effect, fluid, this energy that can be moved from one being to another. Change is the essence. So reality, very much contrary to the kind of supposition of the Greeks, is fundamentally change. We can talk about the whole, the Tao, as something that changes fundamentally. And although there are patterns to it, even these patterns themselves appear variable. If, however, we consider the Buddhists, including the Chinese Buddhists, the idea that there are any distinct things at all is part of what is unreal. The only fundamental reality is the interdependent whole. And so for the Buddhists, the idea, when you ask the question, what is reality, Mahayana Buddhists would say, well, it's this fundamental metaphysical substratum, which in Japanese might be translated emptiness, or which Nagarjuna calls the vibrant void. And Theravada Buddhism, although it acknowledges some reality to the kinds of instantaneous configurations of processes that occur, similarly denies that any things or selves are real, at least when you take them over time. Now, one of the things that I think is particularly fascinating, just kind of looking back at that wide array of different views that we've just considered, is how many similarities there actually are. Of course, at the outset, I pointed out that human experience does lead people to ask the same kinds of questions. And it's not surprising, given the kind of interdependent beings we are, not necessarily in a Buddhist sense, but just in terms of practical life, that we ask questions about how we should interact with each other, what our goals are, etc. But it is interesting that certain kinds of visions recur. One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind, however, is the danger of oversimplifying. To think again about the way Taoist terms sometimes were used to translate Buddhist terms when Buddhism first came to China. There were some commonalities that carried over. There is something in common between the Tao and the doctrine of interdependent arising. Namely, both of these are expressions for the whole, in which whatever we are is bound up. But they're not really the same concept. And I think there's always a danger, especially when making kind of broad comparisons, to overemphasize the commonalities. So one thing I think is important to keep in mind in pursuing understanding of the thought of other cultures is that oftentimes a one-to-one translation of terms isn't very perfect. For example, what is the meaning of person? Now, you might find in various languages a word that more or less corresponds to the word person in English. But even the meaning of person is problematic. After all, it's related to a term meaning mask. So the suggestion is that although we tend to think of ourselves as a person, as something pretty concrete, that even in English, the notion has something to do with what appears. But suppose we get rid of those worries for the moment. Even if we try to translate a certain term as person, what have we conveyed by that? Have we conveyed our idea of, our Western idea at any rate, of an individual self that's fundamental? Or could person mean what it means for the Confucians, something that is inherently relational? Or as it means for the American Indians, something that doesn't make sense if you take it outside of its context. Or for the Yoruba, something that is a developmental goal in part, that you become a person as you become morally mature. When we see the word person, which of those meanings comes forward to us? The problem is that we naturally tend to see those meanings that have the most salience for us as being the meanings that the word has. And so I think it's important to keep in mind, at the very least, that a lot of these words in systems that are unfamiliar hang together. It doesn't make sense to talk about the person in the Yoruba context unless you know some other things about how people are understood, how their goals are understood, how the relationship between the living and the dead is understood, and so on. As long as concepts are recognized to occur in clusters, I think we're doing the right sort of thing, even though we create more doubts for ourselves. If we at least raise the question, when I see the word person as a translation, how should I understand that? How does that fit in with what else I know about the culture? I think we're taking the right first step. But there are some interesting parallels, nonetheless, among the kinds of answers that different philosophical systems have given to somewhat similar questions, or at times, in a kind of parallel way, the kind of convergence of answers to slightly different questions. One that I find particularly fascinating is the fact that many schools of thought have raised the whole question of language. Western thought, certainly quite recently, has paid a lot of attention to language. The philosopher Wittgenstein wrote a lot in the 20th century about how words are always part of what he calls language games. In a way, this is another way of putting the same point that I was just trying to make about concept clusters. Words don't occur in isolation, but their meaning has to do with the meanings of a lot of other words that they're used with. If you think about the way buzzwords take on a life of their own, part of the life that they take on depends on a whole context in which people assume a lot of things in common. So Western thought, in a way, is coming to realize that there are a lot of difficulties with simply assuming that our language transparently means what it is we want to say. But the many cases where via negativa, in one sense or another, is used in the thinking of many cultures, I think is fairly fascinating. To stay within Western culture, mystics in the Western tradition, sometimes fearing persecution, granted, but nevertheless, in attempting to articulate their experiences, often felt it was important not to try to say exactly what happened. They felt that words were just inadequate to that. So what they would try to do instead was to say certain things around the experience. Nicholas of Cusa, for example, a medieval thinker, focused on how we have to recognize things in the world as not other than God. Well, that's a kind of interesting way of putting it. The connection between God and creation is a very problematic one in Christian thought. But the idea of a kind of deep connection, a non-otherness, is something that he wanted to really emphasize. Similarly, Meister Eckhart frequently found himself resorting to negative claims. At least he had a lot less difficulty with church authorities when he did that. But we find worries about language appearing in other cultures as well. Even though Confucius is fairly confident that language can do most of the work we want it to do, he's emphatic about the need to make sure that the meanings that we have in our interpersonal reality are actually reflected in our language. That we don't have words giving titles to people who aren't fulfilling those titles. That we use words to really pointedly specify the things that we actually do mean. Again, there's a sense that language can be misleading, even if it's relatively a good tool. The Taoists are less sanguine about language in general. They tend to point out that there's always a danger that language is going to lead us astray, if only because language freezes an insight once we have it. We have some experiences. The whole idea of learning from experience might be sort of viewed as coming up with the right sort of principles to use next time around. But maybe this time isn't going to be like the last time. Maybe it only seems to be relevantly similar. Maybe some of the factors that you're not paying attention to because you think, this old event, I know how to deal with that, is what's prominent in your mind. So there's always a danger that language is going to give us bad advice. We don't even notice that it's advice because we think in language. So that's one of the reasons for the Taoist strategy of disrupting things. When Zhuangzi has surprising people speak wisdom and intelligent people like Hui Shi really appear rather stilted, it isn't just to make fun of people who seem to have authority, but it's to point out that what we're expecting to be the relevant feature here might not be the relevant feature at all. That it's really essential to trust our perception more than our language. The Buddhists similarly have some concern about language, and I think this is particularly evident in Zen Buddhism, where the idea of pre-reflective thought is getting back to experience, our nature as it is prior to language. Again, this does have resonance with Taoist notions, the idea that we want to go back to what our nature actually is, independent of categories and preconceptions that we bring to all of our experience. The fact that you do find these themes recurring in many societies, I think, can only be called fascinating. And the fact that oftentimes, even as we explore the experiences of philosophical traditions, we find a lot of enrichment coming from outside. Artificially, in a way, we talk about Western thought. But of course, Western thought has lots of understandings built into it that come from Africa originally, even though by Western thought we usually are focusing on Europe. There's some thought that there was some communication through the Silk Route between India and Europe. Scholars differ on whether or not they think that that's really true, but people were never staying exactly in the same place. People have always learned from one another. And we find, certainly as you approach closer to modern times, just the various movements of ideas through history. The idea of Buddhism, for example, beginning in India, but actually not taking root there nearly as prominently as it does in much of the rest of Asia, moving to China, moving to Japan. Along with these movements, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are also cultural tendencies to invest their own indigenous experience into new ideas that come about. So, for example, the development of a lot of interest in colorful characters in Buddhism, in Chinese Buddhism, in part reflective perhaps of the fact that the Taoist tradition had lots of Taoist immortals that were characters in stories that were well known and beloved. The fact that the flavor of a philosophy is never completely independent of the culture that it arrives in is something that I think we really need to keep in mind. This, of course, raises again the whole issue of culturalism versus universalism, something we talked about in connection, in particular, with African thought, since this has been a prominent issue in contemporary Africa. The idea of culturalism is the idea that philosophies are largely a product of their time and place, that the things that people are worrying about are a function of what the cultural conditions are at that time. Universalism, on the other hand, holds that human experience is always relatively alike, and that philosophers in general throughout the world are applying the same methods to resolve them. They attempt to criticize traditions or just not take things for granted, to investigate, to inquire, to worry when there are inconsistencies in people's practices or beliefs, and to try to somehow resolve them. If that's indeed what philosophy is about, then it might seem not so important that cultures modify the way that they operate. I think there's an insight in both of these. Both of them have something important to say. Of course, human experience does have a lot of common dimensions. The questions that are raised wouldn't be so common, and the recurrence of kinds of answers wouldn't show up in so many places, I don't think, if that weren't the case. But what philosophy is a way of dealing with human experience. Philosophy, it might be said to provide maps of sorts to help us deal with certain kind of situations. And philosophers try to analyze situations in order to help others grapple with the same sorts of situations that they themselves encounter. Whether the maps work or they don't work is going to be a question of how they're applied and to what they're applied. Sometimes maps don't work because they aren't the maps that are really designed to deal with this kind of situation. And why is that? Well, it may be because they come from somewhere else, or it may be that there's something about this particular cultural set of variables that just wasn't in play when someone made this map. I think that's one of the things that makes it also fascinating. The fact is that we can look at maps coming from many different traditions and try to figure out, well, which of these tools are really going to be useful to us? My guess is that as humanity goes forward and continues to raise philosophical questions, of course there will be modifications because of new circumstances, because of new degrees of communication, and so on. But one of the really exciting things about our future is that because there is more cultural communication, we might be able to draw on all of these traditions, viewing them all as part of our human heritage. Thank you.